here. We also thank you, AC, our Director of Schools, for all your support of this evening. And we thank Jacob Hazard, the Dean of Faculty, who propagates and facilitates this process. The writing grant was the inspiration of two of our alums, in fact, two of Miss Bennett's former pupils, Caroline Cross Chinland and Annie Sanders, both of the class of 1958, and a search of the Kingswood Clarion of those years shows two young writing minds of considerable promise and just sharp wits who were nurtured by Miss Bennett. And they were the ones who created the community around Miss Bennett's legacy to create this night over 3 decades. It's a significant act of preparation and discipline to be a Bennett participant and to be a Bennett reader. May I ask those of you who have been our Bennett recipients in the past to stand up for 1 second? Thank you. And also, we're lucky, I know, to have at least one alum of Miss Bennett's classroom here, and maybe more. If you were a pupil of Miss Bennett's, would you stand for a moment and be recognized? Yeah. Like one of our readers tonight, Miss Bennett attended the Breadloaf Writers Conference some years ago in 1954. Miss Bennett is remembered as having an intense and devoted interest in the use of the English language and for a remarkable ability to inspire a precise and disciplined use of words in the written expression of thoughts and ideas, and also for her love of poetry, in the words of the framers of this evening. And it's our privilege and it's our obligation just to say one or two things about Miss Bennett, because we all stand in her extended sunlight of one sort or another, because it was her devotion that inspires other English teachers for years to come. And of course, those English teachers go on to inspire our students, and students only need to look to the east side of the library there to realize that we have a stack full of very distinguished alumni writers, and our alumni writers are important decision makers. They're important shapers of thought. They are remarkable people. Even the foot soldiers of Miss Bennett's classrooms are very, very grateful, and all of us are grateful to those teachers of writing, all of whom all of our faculty helped teach writing. She was known as Benny by her friends and fellow teachers, and a colleague said this about her: Elizabeth Bennett, an unfashionable woman, a private woman, with unfathomable riches of mind and character and personality. Kingswood was lucky in her. We who knew her were lucky simply by being what she was. She enriched her world and ours. And of course, one of my favorite stories about Miss Bennett was from a couple of her students who went to visit her at a hospital in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and found her, in convalescence and in a state of real, quiet, and had said much, seemingly in an unconscious state. And they asked the nurse where she might be found, and to which the nurse said, "She's just laying there resting." And up to that time, Miss Bennett, who had not spoken at all, spoke softly but precisely to correct the nurse, "Just lying there." We have the great fortune of having two readers. We always have our past winner to read first, who points the way to the threshold of our award winner. And we couldn't not seize the opportunity because our two writers tonight they work so closely together that it was an opportunity that we could not fail to seize. And we asked them if they would introduce one another tonight. And so that's a wonderful opportunity. First, we will hear from Jordan Rossen, and then we will hear from Sarah Appleton Pine, who was our first-year grant recipient. Thank you.
Well, I did the truly awful thing while transferring tote bags of forgetting the hard copy of Jordan Rossen's introduction in my tote bag, so I'm reading off of my phone, which is a pet peeve of mine, but I hope you'll forgive me. It was love at first sight when Jordan Rossen showed up to my teaching demo with a box of Timbits in hand. That night, we shared calamari and Brussels sprouts and had our first typical Jordan and Sarah conversation. We asked each other questions about our pedagogy, what it's like to be a creative writer teaching college comp or high school English, and compared MFA experiences, he, of course, having attended the University of Montana in between years at Michigan's law school. Don't let Jordan fool you about his talent. I'll never forget the moment when I saw a neat row of literary journals on his bookshelves and realized they were all journals he'd been published in. The Colorado Review, 14 Hills, the Baltimore Review, Upstreet. Then I read Rock Creek, which came out in the Chattahoochee Review my first spring knowing Jordan. The story was so very Montana, and Jordan holds the reader close to the protagonist. You're in the truck with him, feeling his grief in ways that seem strange at first until they don't. It was exhilarating to bump desk chairs and share ginger mints with someone so talented. And then Jordan and I became what I coveted most, writer friends. He invited me to swap work with him, feigning being unqualified at critiquing nonfiction, but I knew he was just being silly. I was awed he even cared for my critique. Although having my personal life so exposed felt terrifying at first, Jordan made it feel less scary. Soon, Word's Track Changes feature was just another way we communicated. Before long, we were obsessively checking our submittable accounts, celebrating rejections together, and joking with each other about acceptances until they started to turn real. Jordan placed Forge the Ring with Carve out last summer, and Redbird Bluebird with Grist forthcoming this spring. Jordan also impressed me with the writer conferences he attended. First, the Napa Valley Writers Conference last summer, when he worked with such writers as Lauren Groff, and even more so when he earned a place in August at Middlebury's prestigious Breadloaf. Jordan's characters and their worlds have also caught the eyes of agents, at Breadloaf in particular, and now he's begun the task every short story writer is asked to do, write a novel. He'll do it, I know, and I will love it and read it for him again and again and again. But his short stories will always have a soft spot in my heart. So much so that Jordan has changed the way I read forever. Now, whenever I read a short story or a collection of them, I hear the voice, a certain crisp description, a piece of well-spoken dialogue, and I think to myself, this reminds me of Jordan. He's become a sort of standard, and he's become, too, the best writerly friend I've ever had.
Oh my gosh, that was so nice. I don't know what standards you have after that, but just lower them significantly. I'm also going to take off my jacket just because I am a writer/sweater, and we're going to try to minimize the extent to which I perspire during the reading. Thanks, everybody, for coming. It's muggy out. I appreciate you all being here. I want to thank the Bennett funders, Caroline Chinland and Annie Sanders, for their continued support of the grant. Thanks to Susan Post for organizing the event. Thanks to Noelle and Jacob and Amy Claire. Thanks to my mom for driving up from Maryland, and to my friends who have come from Grosse Pointe, Ann Arbor, and elsewhere. Finally, thank you to the English department. I've said it before, but I love you guys. I'm so grateful to be able to work with all of you. So this summer I wrote a new story, and then I revised two earlier ones, and it's one of the revised stories that I'll be reading today. Just as sort of a heads up, it's on the sort of bleaker side. It's not necessarily, it's a little dark, I guess. It's about a relationship between a mother and her son, and both my mother and I want to emphasize that it really is fiction and not nonfiction in disguise. They are flawed. They are flawed characters. So no need to, after the reading, say you're an awful person or something like that. Also, there's a swear word in the first sentence, just as a heads up. The story is called Dust. Shortly before Barb's son Grant was supposed to leave for Michigan State University, he told her there was no way in hell he was going, and that she would have known this if she weren't such an arrogant, self-involved, malicious bitch. "Since when have you thought I was arrogant?" said Barb. The following week, she came home from work to find him gone. There was a note on the kitchen counter. It said, "I've withdrawn my trust money and am moving to Florida." It said that he hated her, that he wished her dead. "Don't even think about trying to contact me," it said. She tried to contact him. She called his cell phone several times. She listened to his voice on the recording, nervous and sweet, and then left a message. "Please call, I'll worry," she said in one. "You're a selfish prick," she said in another. After a few days, his voicemail recording was replaced by the default automated number. When she called the next day, his phone was no longer in service. Grant, Barb knew, really did hate her, and he had told her why. He blamed her for his obsessive-compulsive disorder and for the death of his father. He resented how she dealt with these things, through over-drinking and sedatives and painting, though she'd never had an artistic bone in her body. She'd bought the complete series of The Joy of Painting, all 13 seasons. Bob Ross calmed her. His soothing voice, his love for nature, all those happy little clouds and trees. She'd come home from work, lay out a tarp under an easel on the living room floor, and paint. Her husband's death and the diagnosis of Grant's OCD happened when Grant was in 8th grade. Barb's painting phase lasted for 1 year, the sedatives for 2, the overdrinking for 3. So she felt he was right to resent her for those years when she was depressed and floundering. But her husband was the one who'd had OCD, not her, and she rejected the idea that she'd somehow triggered her husband's heart attack. He, too, had been an alcoholic, a kind and apologetic one who'd grown troubled and overwhelmed. "I don't know where I am," he told her once, the summer before he died, "but I couldn't be happier." Then he wept. In the week after Grant had gone, Barb spent hours in his empty bedroom. It smelled in there like dirty socks, but she didn't open the window. On the bare mattress lay his bath towel, perfectly folded, and Barb imagined him using it to dry off the day he left. The room was basically empty, no clothes, bedding, books, but he'd left his acoustic guitar, and Barb withdrew it from the case. She ran her fingers along the strings, the shoulder strap. Then she mimed a few gigantic strums the way Grant used to. Barb worked at Wayne State University, handling ethics complaints that employees filed against one another, and collaborating with the film department to make eye-rolling instructional videos. May Orwin ask applicants for gifts while deciding who to hire? May Dana take paid leave to attend a conference and then skip the conference? No, they may not. At lunch, Robin, her paralegal, asked about Grant's transition to college. "Does your house feel weird with Grant away?" she said. "I bet it feels weird." "It's all right," Barb lied. "Better than I expected." "I wouldn't fret," said Robin. "When my youngest left for college, he came home every other weekend." Robin leaned forward. "They don't want to leave the nest just as much as you don't want them to leave the nest." Barb was able to focus on work during the day, but at night, she worried endlessly about Grant's fate. Homelessness, drug addiction, a mental disorder that might go undiagnosed. His going off the OCD medication was another concern. He went off it for a while when he was 16, became obsessed with his bodily waste, started hoarding his fingernail clippings and peeing into Ziploc bags. Barb would find them under the couch, behind the TV, and now, as she wandered around the house alone, alternately crying and berating herself for crying, there were times when she was sure she saw them. "I'm being haunted by baggies of urine," she told her sister Marnie over the phone. In November, she searched online for youth programs, Crossroads, Strive, Perfect Pals, and submitted mentor applications. What she needed was a surrogate. If she must lose a son, she shouldn't have to do it cold turkey. "I'm curing my empty nest syndrome by filling my nest back up again," she told Robin at work. "That's one way to do it," Robin said. "What, you're adopting a dog? Mark my words, before you know it, Grant will start coming home every weekend." The Crossroads office was part nonprofit, part Chuck E. Cheese, a room of cubicles beside a room with a ball pit. A woman interviewed Barb and at the end told her they'd be assigning her a mentee. "Wonderful," Barb said. She clasped her hands together. "When can I expect to hear from you?" "Couple weeks, but you'll hear from the mentee's caregiver. The mentee is a boy, if that's all right. He preferred a female mentor over a male one. It's not something we normally do, but we try to accommodate." "Of course," Barb said. "His name is Caden, and he's 10 years old. He lives with his auntie, only he calls her Mom. He sounds darling," Barb said. At work later that day, she researched activities for her and Caden. Conducting personal business on the job was, of course, against the ethics code. She'd even made a video about it. May Leslie plan her wedding while on university time? No, she may not. Barb jam-packed the first Saturday with Caden. They went to brunch at the Detroit Zoo and then to the polar bear exhibit. Christmas was a week away, and Santa was there. "Who knew Santa would be at the zoo?" Barb said. "I don't believe in Santa Claus," Caden said. "Me neither," Barb said. "My son Grant believed in Santa until he was 9, too old. It was my fault. I kept drawing sleigh tracks in the snow. I made fake deer droppings out of clay." "Arts and crafts," Caden said. "I love arts and crafts." "I do too," Barb said. They went downtown to Campus Martius Park and ice skated. As they made their way around the rink, grabbing each other's arms for support, Barb felt certain that people were staring at them. The ice skaters were surely from the suburbs, and she thought they might be judging her and Caden, the fact that he was black and she was white. Also, the whole thing seemed strangely illicit. It seemed like she was on a date with Caden, like she was cheating on Grant. "Watch me be Adam Rippon," Caden said. He skated ahead of her and did a slow spin, his arms up over his head like in ballet. "Very nice," Barb said. "You're very talented." In the evening, they went to the Wizard of Oz at the Fox Theater. In line, a high school girl gave Caden the once-over and then whispered something to her friend. The two of them smiled. "What's funny?" Barb said. "I just said I liked his boots," said the girl. "It's true," said her friend. "Oh," Barb said. She hadn't noticed Caden's boots, and she looked at them now. They were flannel, with a band of fur around the ankle. He rested his foot on the toe and modeled it for the girls. "Killer boots," said one of them. "It's the fur," Caden said. "The fur is what makes them." "Aren't they fabulous?" said Barb, wanting to participate, to act as if she'd admired the boots all along. The first Saturday in January, she took Caden to the Institute of Arts for the kids' tour, and then they went to her house, where she set up 2 easels with canvases. She put on the joy of painting, and they painted together. The episode was called Tranquil Valley, and Bob Ross had dedicated it to his mother. "She's my special lady," he told the camera. "I'm a mama's boy, and I don't care who knows it." "What we're doing is called wet-on-wet painting," Barb said to Caden. It's nice because the whole thing can be finished in half an hour. As the canvases dried, they made cookies from scratch. Is he your son? Asked Caden, pointing to a photo on the fridge. Yes, that's Grant. He's handsome, Caden said. Thank you, Barb said. What should we do now? We could see more photos of Grant, Caden said. So Barb got out the scrapbooks, and they flipped through them while eating cookies. This one is sad, Caden said. He was referring now to a photo of Grant as a 6-year-old, cradling his stuffed velveteen rabbit. Grant's expression was stern, and he looked mysterious and gaunt, a child in a Depression-era photograph. He's not sad in that one, she said. It's the shadows. No one could look happy in that lighting. I could, Caden said, and then he smiled sweetly in a way that broke her heart. Weeks passed, and slowly Barb understood that spending time with Caden wasn't helping. It was draining being a mother of a 10-year-old again, even for just one day a week. And he had developed an interest in her romantic life, or the lack of one. It startled Barb that he sensed her loneliness. Once, when they went bowling, he arranged for the manager to bring over complimentary sodas. The manager was large and red-faced, and when Barb looked up, surprised, he tipped an imaginary hat. How nice, Barb said. He's single, Caden said. I checked. He gave her a thumbs up. She'd spent 2 months mentoring Caden when Grant phoned. It was from a number Barb didn't recognize. I want you to send my guitar to me, he said. How are you? She said. Fantastic. Ready for the address? Hold on a minute. Barb looked for a pen and paper. Okay, ready. Grant gave her the address. Then he said, guess what I'm going to do with it? I give up, she said. My roommate is going to use it to play a song at your funeral. You're having a funeral for me? The guests will mainly be my roommate and my new friends. I invited Aunt Marnie too, but she said she couldn't make it. I bought an urn and everything. But I'm alive, Barb said. No worries, Grant said. Then he hung up. Barb phoned Marnie, who confessed that yes, Grant had called to invite her to the funeral. I told him there was no way in hell I was going, Marnie said. Holding a funeral for you, can you imagine? No, Barb said, I cannot imagine. Barb lay awake the entire night, and by morning, she had decided to go to her funeral. She called Marnie and got the details. You want my opinion? Marnie said. My opinion is that in no uncertain terms should you go. I didn't want your opinion, Barb said. May I use your phone? Barb asked Caden on Saturday. They had just finished painting while watching the joy of painting, Caden's new favorite show. I need to call Grant. He leaned against the sliding door. Why can't you use yours? Because he won't answer if I call on mine. Caden reluctantly handed Barb his phone. After a few rings, Grant answered. Grant, she said. God damn you, he said, and hung up. Barb looked out through the sliding door. The wind was batting the tree branches around. Happy trees, she thought. You're sad right now, Caden said, and when she didn't respond, he slid open the glass door, the sound of the wind suddenly deafening. He closed it shut again. It's a twister, he said, and then he hummed a few bars from the witch's song in The Wizard of Oz. You might be sad forever. Probably, Barb said. Despite the wind, it was unseasonably warm, and Barb took Caden to the playground. He shimmied up the rim of the spiral slide. In seconds, he was at the top, dangling by his arms. Be careful, Barb said. I will. He jumped off and stood with his arms over his head like a gymnast after a vault. I'm Simone Biles, he said. Very nice, Barb said. She no longer thought it was a good idea for her to be a mentor. I give you a perfect score. Early Tuesday morning, she folded her black dress into her carry-on. The funeral was that afternoon, and she wasn't staying overnight. She wasn't even getting a motel. She would put on the dress in the airport bathroom. She imagined running up to Grant and throwing her arms around him right in the middle of a dirge. It was all the terrible mistake, she would say. The coroner had misidentified the body. As it happened, she only caught the tail end of her funeral. The first flight was delayed, and she missed the connecting flight out of Charlotte. The service was in the backyard of Grant's house, and she snuck around and took a seat in a chair off to the side. Grant was at the front, on top of a platform, thanking the guests. Beside him was a table with an urn, surrounded by candles. When he spotted her, he did a double take, but kept going with his speech. He sounded comfortable, composed. He had on a dark gray suit. Barb was surprised by how real the funeral seemed. She was expecting it to look fake, a funeral and a high school play, but the guests appeared respectable and sad. They were dressed in black. The woman next to Barb was crying. She was Grant's age, as everyone there seemed to be. Barb handed the woman a Kleenex. "How do you know the deceased?" Barb asked. "I work with her son," the woman whispered. "Where?" Barb asked. "Health Sciences Library, custodial service." "Shh." Afterward, Barb made her way to the front, inserting herself into a circle that had formed around Grant. "I made it," she said. "I see you did," Grant said. The people in the circle fidgeted. They were wanting an explanation of who she was, but she wanted Grant to have to do that. "I'm sorry," said a young man eventually. "You're Grant's mother," she said. "Stepmother," Grant said. He smiled, tight-lipped. He looked as if he might hit her, and she found herself bracing for it. "Come on inside," he said. They went to his bedroom, which was clean and well-lit and had a connecting bathroom. Through the window, she watched his guests milling about. So he'd formed a community here. These people seemed to care about him, at least in some sense, and it reassured her. "I'm going to take a shower," he said. "You have a right to hate me," she said. "I know I do," he snorted. "You were a pill-popping drunk. You were absent. And now when I want you to be absent," he motioned with his hands, "voila." "You killed me off," she said. "I shouldn't have rubbed it in your face by calling you. That was unnecessary." "This whole thing is unnecessary," she yelled. She could see a guest in the backyard shield his eyes and peer up at her. She began to cry. "I don't know," Grant said quietly. He sounded almost apologetic, almost. "I've wanted to kill you before." Barb felt her jaw drop, and the reaction seemed almost comical, the clownish inadequacy of it. She moved away from him, away from the window, and back toward the door. He followed. "I want to kill you again and again," he said. "You don't," she said. She struggled to find words. She backed up until she was in the doorway. He stepped closer. She could see blackheads on his nose. She could smell his deodorant, his breath. He pointed an imaginary gun at her face with his thumb and forefinger. "Right between the eyes," he said. And then he shut the door. She heard the sliding lock. She heard the toilet flush in his bathroom and the loud spurt of the shower. Barb felt cheated, betrayed. If Grant had been a wreck, she would have been more understanding. She would have mothered him. She would even have pretended to be his stepmother. Outside, in the glare and heat, she walked to the platform. 2 guests were stacking the folding chairs. A few others were eating pastries by the hors d'oeuvre table. They were staring at her. Who was this old, sweating woman? Barb picked up the urn. She'd expected it to be empty, but she heard whatever was inside shift around. She yanked the lid off. "You can't scatter those here," a woman shrieked, just as a handful of pebbles hit the floor. A few cigarette butts, clumps of dirt. More of the guests were shouting now, and as they were, a bare-boned chicken wing fell out onto the pile. A cascade of sand, fine and white, poured out, followed by a few feathers. The guests had crowded around her. "Hey, Grant's mom was a bird," a girl joked. But no one laughed. They were marveling at the pile. Even Barb was mesmerized by it. She felt like a magician and a mad scientist, except she had brought herself back to life. She was Dr. Frankenstein and his monster. She stepped off the platform, and the mourners moved out of the way. She tucked the urn under her arm and walked to the rental car. On Friday, Barb phoned Caden to see what he had in mind for the next day. "Painting and then the playground is always an option," he said. And so that evening, Barb coated the urn with several layers of white. On Saturday, she gave it to Caden to paint. He examined it from different angles. "Okay," he said, "but you can't look until it's finished." Barb went into the kitchen and poured a cup of coffee. All that week, she'd wondered about the aftermath in Florida. She didn't want to be responsible for Grant losing his friends, which seemed likely. Maybe he would go to a new city, form a new community, hold a new funeral. Maybe over the next few years, that was what he would do, travel across the country holding funeral after funeral. Eventually, Caden came in and led her to the urn. "Oh, Caden, it's gorgeous." Barb stood admiring it. There were trees and mountains and a lake and even a happy little cabin. "It's stunning." "It's my best work," Caden said. And just maybe Grant was on his way to Michigan right now, preparing to hunt her down. Here, Barb said. She got the box set of The Joy of Painting and gave it to Caden. For services rendered, your first job as a professional artist. Caden was clearly pleased. He bowed low, like a prince before a dance, then held the box set to his chest. This would be their last Saturday. She would inform Crossroads and not tell Caden in person. She wasn't afraid he'd be upset. She was afraid he wouldn't care. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Not so bad, actually, comparatively. Thanks, guys. So it's my pleasure to introduce who is known as my platonic soulmate, Sarah Appleton Pine. A few months into Sarah's first year at Cranbrook, she said to me, "You know, I realize that I'm closer in age to our high school students than I am to you." This was not an exchange that brought me joy, I would say. Because she is a younger teacher, at least relatively, it might be easy to discount her. But to do so would be a mistake, because she's an exceptional teacher and an exceptional writer. She's the sort of writer I'm jealous of, partly because of her ability to excel in a variety of different forms of writing. She writes critical essays, personal essays, lyric essays, hybrids that effortlessly blend one form with another. For example, consider the opening paragraph from one of her nonfiction pieces that is part personal essay, part critical essay, published earlier this year in Plowshares. Sarah writes, "I stumbled across Donald Hall's The Third Thing, an essay on his marriage, not long before my wedding. Hall's measured tone and rich details came in sharp contrast to all the bridal materials I was bombarded with, the knot checklist that filled my inbox, the glossy magazines with sumptuous weddings I could never afford and didn't want anyway. Yes, I was grateful to be getting married, but in the swirl of wedding glamour, marriage itself was so easily lost. Work by Donald Hall brought marriage back to life for me." The measured tone and rich details that Sarah mentions about Hall's essay could just as easily refer to her own writing. She can also be quick-witted like you wouldn't believe. A couple days ago, I sent her a whiny text, which I do about once a day, that said something like, "Ugh, everything I've ever written sucks." And she texted back immediately, "That is too funny. That's my opening line to your intro." Sarah's work is special because how she views the world is, I really believe, more nuanced than how many of us view it. At least it's more nuanced than how I view it. There is, though, one aspect of the world that gets unadulterated, unnuanced love from Sarah: dogs. A few weeks ago, for instance, in a text conversation about the Bennett reading, she sent me this message: "Let's make the reading dog-friendly. Eddie, Lacey, Oscar, Poppy, Zoe, Lucky. It'll be a real shebang." Yes, any dog is lucky to have Sarah in its life, and the human community at Cranbrook is just as lucky. Her nonfiction has been published in the best literary journals, genuinely the best literary journals in the country: Plowshares, Georgia Review, Michigan Quarterly Review, Kenyon Review. And to understand why, all one needs to do is to read or listen to her work. Please join me in welcoming my friend, Sarah Appleton Pine.
Hello again. My lovely husband brought my paper. I am honored to be a recipient of the Bennett Grant. Thank you to those of you who had a hand in my selection. Thank you to Carolyn and Annie for your continued support of the Bennett Grant. And thank you to Susan Post for organizing and publicizing this reading. Thank you to the administrative team for supporting and celebrating the passions of your faculty. It means a lot to us. Thank you to my colleagues, my friends who have become such a supportive network for me here. when I knew nobody. I wouldn't have been able to write anything at all if it weren't for you. Thank you to my parents for flying all the way here from California. If anyone didn't know, I'm an only child. Now you do. Although today on a walk, my dad told me I was a burden, so, take that for what you will. Thank you to my friends who traveled here from across Michigan tonight. You make me feel special. I would be remiss, of course, if I didn't thank my beautiful Australian Shepherd, Zoe, who grabs a chew toy and hunkers down with me. Of course, thank you always, Andrew. You've borne the brunt of my writing angst, to put it lightly, but you love me anyway. So, Jordan is very good at being funny, and sometimes I can be funny, but my piece isn't so laughable as his. There aren't those moments, I don't think, but it's okay. I think you'll still enjoy it. I'm excited to read it to you because it's the first piece I ever wanted to write, and I've been talking about it since I was a little girl. It means a lot to me because it was hard to write, and last fall, as Jordan pointed out, it was published in the Michigan Quarterly Review. So it means a lot for me to be able to read an abbreviated version. Don't worry, the long one would take an hour, so I'll just read a shortened form. Oh, and I'm getting over a cough, so I'll do my best not to break out into a coughing fit. Someone behind a curtain is farting loudly, over and over again, but we don't talk about it. A nurse comes in and doesn't mention it either. She goes behind the curtain, and I hear her say, "Earl, you need to put your pants on." They wrestle. He protests, and unintelligible whines and grunts. She gives up, leaves, and I know he is there, behind the curtain, naked, farting. Next to this shrouded resident is a man whose curtain is spread open. He is sitting cross-legged on his bed, shirtless, chanting. It is as if he's preaching to a crowd of people, and in looking at this invisible crowd, he cannot see us. We're in California's Central Valley, so there's a chance he isn't preaching, but soul calling, upholding Hmong tradition by calling his soul home before he dies. His voice rises and falls, a flow of throaty syllables I cannot understand. The nursing home smell makes me feel dirty, so I want to wash my whole body, rinse the smell from my hair. I'm not sure what I notice first in these places. It's either the smell or the old women mumbling at me from their wheelchairs. There is an old woman now, screaming at me in Spanish, shaking her finger at me, cursing me for condemning her to this place. This is a state-run facility in a run-down neighborhood, probably a government project. There's graffiti, and where someone has attempted to cover it up, there's a large swath of paint that doesn't quite match. From the lack of landscaping, I know this facility can't be good. We're visiting Uncle Greg, who's on hospice and here with a bunch of old people, even though he's just barely 44. He couldn't board a bus on his own, so the state brought him here after his latest release from prison. It's the cheapest facility his body could make it to. His body, too broken down too broken down to do anything else with it. Too many drugs for too long. His liver has given its 2 weeks' notice. His intake papers list his primary diagnosis as end-stage liver disease, 2-2, alcohol and hepatitis C. For Uncle Greg, it was heroin. Heroin, the once chic drug celebrities were getting addicted to in the 90s. Now it calls to mind rural middle America, where it consumes more and more of the population, an epidemic spawned from OxyContin abuse that's found all across America. Addiction as disease, addiction as embarrassment. The public divides on how to view addicts, degenerate or someone suffering. Heroin and opioids more generally are the ultimate escape drugs, Professor Judith Feinberg says. Heroin curbs boredom and a sense of uselessness and inadequacy. Though it blanks out the world in dead-end towns, Feinberg points out, seduces. It numbs, it deadens. Addiction, the equal opportunity affliction, the blight that doesn't discriminate. This much is true. Drugs insinuate themselves into the lives of the rich and the poor and the in-between alike. Recovery does the discriminating. Those hovering around the poverty line lack proper insurance and the ability to cobble together funds for treatment. Even if they manage to pull together money and insurance coverage, the facilities available to them often have no beds and a waiting list that's half a year long. But despite the expense of drugs, it's those with lower incomes that use them more and more devastatingly. Moneyed celebrities face their own tribulations, but on the whole, their environs give them a better shot at sobriety than, say, my uncle in his not up-to-code trailer park in the bad part of Bakersfield, his hometown, the place where he always got arrested, and therefore the place to which he always had to return. Bakersfield began as a settlement of farming families in the 1850s, families who came east over the Tejon Pass to do something different than panning for gold. Eventually, it turned from agriculture to oil. Now, it's a sprawling town hard to navigate after the spread of so many Target Great Lands and super Walmarts and housing developments. Colorful banners always hang limp in the dry Bakersfield heat outside of these new subdivisions with names like The Grove or Olympian Hills or Poplar Point. But in Bakersfield, 1 in every 5 individuals lives below the poverty line. In between his prison sentences, my uncle sometimes lived in Oasis Village, one of the many trailer parks strung along South Union Avenue like rotten teeth, as Lois Henry writes in the Bakersfield Californian. The article, in fact, features my uncle. Features him because once again, one of his many trailers had burned to the ground. She continues, trash everywhere, busted out windows, holes in floors, holes in ceilings, exposed wiring, no heat, no gas, leaking bathrooms, leaking roofs, bowed-in walls, and on. Describing these parks as third world seems quaint compared to the reality. In the article, Henry fills a role often filled by outsiders. She calls attention to the disease marring her own town, the troubling fact that in a place whose growth can be quantified by its suburban housing developments and an influx of oil money, there is, right there in the part of town known as Oildale, a segment of the population existing in rot and decrepitude, left behind while others move up. On trips back, Dad always points out his former homes, most of them either boarded up or gone altogether. Uncle Greg and Dad and Aunt Blanket grew up here in trailers and projects all over Shafter and Bakersfield as their mom and Benny, Dad and Aunt Blanket's stepdad, but Uncle Greg's real one, time for sign-in, moved around again and again, migrant farm workers who could never make rent. Benny was the sort of man who beat his children with a belt or whatever was handy, who took his dentures out at the table if he felt like it, and did other things to make you think you were dirt because he was the one who put food on the table and a roof over your head, damn it. And unless you grew up around him, his stutter and Bakersfield accent was so thick it was hard to tell if he was speaking English. In the summers, Dad and Aunt Blanket visited their real dad, who was off working in places like Oregon or Florida, wherever there was picking to be done or work to be had. They spent these summers entertaining each other, swimming in alligator-riddled swamps in Florida, walking the streets of Seattle to pass the time, their dad present when he could be, drunk sometimes, the sort of father they knew loved them even if he loved to drink more, but never want to raise a hand. Dad and Aunt Blanket could escape Bakersfield, but Uncle Greg was always left behind with Benny. They could hate Benny, knowing they didn't have his blood coursing through their veins. Uncle Greg couldn't. Having a different dad, it seemed to them, made all the difference, or at least that was the simple answer, and the leaving behinds became longer. As they grew families and careers, they watched their younger half-brother stay, watched him drop out of school, watched a sense of self eddy into Benny's, into Bakersfield, watching him give up on a life poverty-caged in the bad part of town. Uncle Greg was an easy person to love when he was sober or locked up somewhere, so you didn't have to worry about him all the time. He had a boyish voice, a matching grin, and he loved to tell stories. There was something addicting about his excitement, something captivating about his vivid recounting of memories from our lives. He remembered more than any of us, I think, because for long stretches of these times, memories were the only way he could be with us. While we were captivated by these stories, we forgot how few of them there were and how old these stories were by now. We forgot how many more of them he could tell if he wasn't always absent from the birthday parties, the days at the beach, the death of one dog, and the picking out of another. When he was out, loving Uncle Greg was excruciating because you never knew if his failure to answer the phone, for instance, meant he was back on drugs, meant overdose, meant dead. I was immune to this anxiety as a little kid, and Uncle Greg had me charmed. He swept me up with his charisma, his "Hey, sis," and hoisting... Keep it together, Dad. and hoisting me into his arms for a hug, our bundled bodies making side-by-side snow angels, the stories about our dog, old Shorty Ray, he told just to see me laugh. It was so easy to see, to feel how much he loved me, how very much I mattered to him. Stop it, you're gonna make me cry. You have to go sit in the back. David, take him away. Although I couldn't really articulate it then, I'd say now that Uncle Greg was my favorite uncle because he gave me such a generous portion of his love, made me feel like the sole object of his attention. Prison gave him time to devote to me, and I knew even then that I gave him a reason to live, and I loved him for it. But there's always a price, isn't there? His life had never been easy, and I imagine that despite his disposition, his trauma festered, his insecurities corroded, and he solved these things with what was easiest, alcohol and a needle. These were my first years of wanting to get better and not understanding that some people never do. Before the visit to the nursing home, the last time I saw Uncle Greg, I was 16, and he was at the California Men's Colony, locked up, I'm sure, for violating his parole once again. Even though my uncle had been locked up for the majority of my life, this was the first time I had visited him in prison. The first time my dad had let me come along, and only because it was in San Luis Obispo, where we lived, just down the road from the university. Not many people know there's a prison there, or ever think about it once they do find out. On hikes up Bishop's Peak, you can see the Pacific Ocean on one side, and on the other, the nondescript spread of prison buildings. You can hear the crackle of speakers if the wind's blowing right, garbled words I always imagine to be a guard calling prisoners in from their yard. Other California prisons are located in places like Avenal and Soledad and Wasco, inland towns my father wanted to keep me away from, inland towns with none of the quaintness and charm of San Luis. For my prison visit, I picked out my outfit carefully, not because I wanted to look cute or pretty like I imagined many of the women visitors did, but because I didn't know what to wear. No underwire bras, no clothing with metal buttons, no spandex or lycra or chambray. Chambray was what the prisoners wore. The clothing could be neither too loose nor too fitted, which made me think of Goldilocks and the Three Bears. I wasn't sure what the just right fittedness was, and no shower shoes either, the reasoning behind which I still can't figure out. We brought a wad of dollar bills and a jangle of quarters in a Ziploc bag for the vending machines, which I remember serving as a constant source of excitement, a remedy for a lull in conversation. The visiting room smelled of microwave-heated food and crinkled with cellophane. We made several trips, Uncle Greg dictating what he wanted, since the prisoners are prohibited from handling the cash or pressing the buttons themselves. We shared peanut M&Ms because they didn't have any Nutrageous bars, his favorite. When you visit someone in prison, you are suddenly conscious of your actions. No running, no exuberant displays of affection. You talk in hushed voices, because if you don't, the room will get too noisy, and you'll all get a sharp reprimand from the guard's position around the room. You are conscious of constantly being watched by the guards, by the prisoners, by the other visitors, by strategically positioned cameras. The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation's handbook, Visiting a Friend or Loved One in Prison, states that prisoners and their visitors are permitted only transitory non-sexual touching. As examples, it lists a prisoner guiding his wife away from an obstacle as they walk, or a mother brushing dirt off a prisoner's shirt. I imagine these feel like stolen moments, that a husband and wife walking together might aim for an obstacle just for an extra moment of contact. That a mother might sprinkle crumbs on her son's shirt, just be able to brush them off. The handbook goes on to say that behaviors such as feeding each other, touching each other's faces, adjusting each other's clothing, and the like should be avoided. But these gestures, too, seem as intimate as guiding a wife away from an obstacle, as brushing dirt from a prisoner's shirt. The prisoner, remember, is a son, a husband, an uncle. The prisoner, remember, is my uncle, the one who played grocery store with me on the floor of my bedroom, pretending to eat the plastic apples he purchased from me, who mailed me hand-drawn cards for every birthday. We were apart because they don't sell Hallmark in prison. I would want to fix his collar, to tuck in his tag, should it be amiss. I would want to hug him as greeting and as farewell, the way I always have, the way I might hug anyone I love. The Hmong man is still soul-calling, a lulling cadence always in the background, so different from the quiet on our side of the curtain. Uncle Greg is lying in the bed like his body is too heavy to lift itself up. I can tell that the rumpled hospital gown he's wearing is not tied well in the back. It's draped loosely around his neck, tucked in at his sides like a blanket. The bed tilts him upward, which makes me realize that he cannot move on his own. His legs are two insignificant bumps under the light blanket. His arms look so weak that I guess the bulk of his chest is an illusion. His intake papers list pleural effusion as one of his conditions. They note, too, that it's recurring, and I realize fluid fills the tissue lining his lungs. Realize that this fluid-swollen chest means his liver has withered in his body. That ugly word, cirrhosis. In the past, Uncle Greg would have outdone his Hmong neighbor, talked louder, talked longer, spoken animatedly. Uncle Greg would have cracked jokes about him, how they let you chatter as much as you want in here. His own high, nasally voice cutting through the lulling chant. He'd tell us stories and laugh a lot, too. Together, we'd be boisterous, buoyant. But right now, Uncle Greg is silent, barely offering more than the occasional grunt. Sometimes he says yes or no, slowly with great effort, in answer to our questions. On his side of the curtain, everything has slowed down, movement sluggish, requiring enormous effort. I'm referring to all of us when I say this. I want my uncle back badly, like I always have when we are apart. And I know, but I'm afraid of letting myself feel that this is the last time I can want this while he is still a body. That soon he will be ash in a plastic box we'll keep on a shelf in the garage. What I can't stop thinking about is how dark his hair is. This is something I hadn't expected, but I also hadn't expected the skin, papery, thin, prone to scabs that never heal. It's a type of skin I associate with old people, the same exact skin my grandma had before she died in her 70s. And yet, he has a full head of hair, dark, thick, and poorly cut, sticking up in jagged tufts. None of him matches. This infirmity, his age, this place, his silence. Uncle Greg was my pen pal. All throughout my childhood and early adolescence, Uncle Greg and I wrote letters and talked on the phone while he was in prison. That my parents would encourage such a close bond between the two of us never struck me as odd. He was my uncle, and he loved me, which seemed reason enough. But shortly after the prison visit, I stopped talking to him. It was a split decision I made after our call dropped. Since the visit, he'd been out for only a few months before going back in again. I think by then, he'd long since lost his will to live on the outside. The promises he'd made a few months before were just empty platitudes. After all, what was there to return to but Bakersfield? Life inside might not have been lavish, but at least he could count on 3 square meals a day and regular entertainment. Hell, there was even a halfway decent lending library. When the call dropped, I burst into tears, so stricken with grief, since I knew I could not call him back, since I could not know when he might call again, or if I'd be home when he did. I knew then that he was devastating me, that I did not want to feel this devastated ever again. He is killing himself, I realized finally. Whether it is now or later, he will die from this drug addiction. An overdose maybe, but his liver will fail more likely. He will never get better. This is and always will be his life as long as he is alive to live it. If I cried when a call dropped, how would I handle his death? I realize now my decision was cruel. At 16, I decided I did not have the fortitude to withstand the loss of someone who loved me so completely, who asked to hear every detail of my life and then asked follow-up questions, who asked to hear about all the books I read, who was the only person I'd pick up the phone for and sustain a long conversation with, who made me happy, who loved and loved and loved. We talked about writing his story together someday in the future, but I knew, as I heard the drone of the disconnected call, that he would be dead before that day came, that I would have to shape my world without him alive in it one day or another. At 16, I wanted the choice to be mine. How could I have blotted out the one person whose love had always nurtured me, and who was sustained by loving me simply because I couldn't imagine my world without him in it? When I actually saw his face, his body, I knew there was nothing my dad could have done to prepare me for the way a drug addict looks before he dies. In those moments of our last visit together, Uncle Greg was asking me a question when he looked at me. I could hear him saying, "Why, sis?" His voice in my head was imploring, not sad, despite everything. I'd never heard it that way. But looking at him, I wondered if a tear would slip out the corners of his eyes, if he could even still cry anymore, or if he could only ask me, silently, why he ended up this way, why he could not find it in himself to live a different life, why he was leaving our lives this time for good. When we left, it was only to me that he spoke, and it was as if he had been saving up for this moment, crafting this one sentence carefully in his mouth, building up the voice to speak it. His voice, when it finally came, was the only part of him that didn't feel fragile. "Bye, honey, I love you," he said, as if we'd been talking the whole time. We did it.
On behalf of the Bennett Grant Committee and Caroline Chinlin and Annie Sanders, we're very grateful for a splendid evening of wonderful flowering of creativity. Please join us for some more food and conversation. Good night, everyone, and thank you so much.